Hello, bonjour, and oki to everyone, and welcome to Nonprofits at 2. I'm Karen Ball, President and CEO of CCVO. I want to acknowledge the land where CCVO is fortunate to call home, the traditional Treaty 7 territory, home of the Blackfoot Confederacy, Siksika, Kainai, Piikani, the Tsuut'ina and Lakota nations, and Métis Nation Region 3. We all understand that this land acknowledgement is only a first step in building understanding and reconciliation. As a member of the charitable sector, I've been spending time thinking about the atrocities of the residential school system, as I know we all have, a system supported by organizations that are at the root of charities operating in Canada to this day. I believe that reconciliation will require us to look critically at ourselves and at our sector and the role that actions taken in the name of charity have played in our nation's genocide. I look forward to opportunities to talk together and to deepen my own understanding about how we consider what is charitable now and in the future. Our Connections Conference is one of these opportunities. It will be taking place November 8th through the 10th, and I encourage you to save that date and join us at that time. Today's gathering is presented by our presenting partner, ATB Financial. Thank you to our media partner, Post Media, and to our core supporters that make it possible for CCVO to strengthen our nonprofit networks and advocate for the needs of our sector every day. During the session, you'll be able to submit questions directly through the chat by directing them to Ask Questions Here. You may also use the chat to direct any technical issues you may be experiencing. And thank you to Marissa Barber and Mary Polychronis working behind the scenes on those accounts. At the end of the event, you'll also have a chance to answer a few short questions about your experience today, and we hope you take the time to complete the short survey and share your thoughts with us so we can ensure that Nonprofits at 2 remains relevant and responsive to your interests and needs. And now onto the main event. It gives me really great pleasure to introduce today's panel. It's a powerhouse panel. I know I'm going to learn a ton, starting with our intrepid moderator, Esmahan Razavi. Esmahan is an associate principal at Champion Communications and HR, and her political experience spans all orders of government, including running for municipal council in 2017, which is where we met. She has worked as a political staffer for the government of Alberta, and most recently as public affairs consultant in British Columbia, and she is a co-founder of Ask Her. Her outstanding work in politics, Esmahan was named one of the top 50 Arab women in North America by Arab Women of Excellence Awards in 2019, and one is Canada's 33 Women of the Year by Chatelaine. Welcome, Esmahan.
Thanks.
Michelle Robinson. Michelle is a facilitator for Mending Broken Hearts, Healing Unresolved Grief through the White Bison Wellbriety Training Institute, and a volunteer on the Calgary Police Services Indigenous Justice Committee, Indigenous Liaison for 12 Community Safety Initiative, co-chair of the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls and Two-Spirit Calgary Committee, as well as an assistant producer for Calgary Animated Objects Society. She's a co-founder of Voices, a group for advocating for Two-Spirit and queer people of color in Calgary, and is the Calgary chair for the Indigenous Peoples Commission in Alberta. It has a podcast called Native Calgarian, which I highly recommend. Michelle was the first First Nation to run for City Council of Calgary and ran as a candidate for the Alberta Liberal Party for Calgary East in 2019. Welcome, Michelle. And pleased to introduce Najwan Al-Ghaneed. Najwan holds a Master's of Science in Sustainable Energy Development and 10 plus years of Canadian and international experience in stakeholder relations, strategic communication, and policy with multinational organizations and nonprofits. She's co-founder of the Next30.ca, a former public member of the City of Calgary Biodiversity Advisory Committee, and the past president of Ask Her YYC. Najwan is currently manager for policy innovation and government relations at the Energy Futures Lab and a 2020 Young Woman Energy winner. Welcome, Najwan. and Chris Henderson. Chris is the Chief Strategist and Partner at Wise Station Communications and Research based out of Edmonton. He is an experienced strategic planner and public and stakeholder engagement specialist, facilitator, campaign manager, communications architect, and writer across a wide variety of cause-based sectors, orders of government, and private sector enterprises. Chris served as Mayor Don Iverson's campaign manager and campaign co-chair since 2007 and is a member of Everyone's Canada, a nonprofit that advocates for a Canadian identity that isn't tied to a particular race or ethnicity, but built around a set of aspirations that includes everyone. Welcome, Chris. And last but certainly not least, Danielle Jocelyn, O2. Danielle Jocelyn holds a bachelor's degree in human relations and organizational development from Concordia University and is currently specializing in social innovation design at Penn State University. She's leading the communication and innovation strategy for youth-led organization Apathy is Boring. Her hope is to help leaders, organizations, and institutions come up with innovative, human-centered solutions to challenge the way we are collectively, to the challenges we are collectively facing as a society, which is a great hope. Mine too. Welcome, Danielle Jocelyn. Welcome to you all. And Esmahan, I will let you take it away.
Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction, Karen. It's so exciting to be able to speak with all four people who are here today, who are superstars in the advocacy realm. So I'm going to start off with a question that is directed at all of you, and Michelle, we'll have you go first this time. So the question is there a single instance or reason that first got you started as an advocate, and how does this relate to the advocacy work that you are doing now?
Yeah, I'm one of those folks that you would consider red flag birth. And I experienced a really awful intervention at the Peter Lougheed Hospital. And as a result, that racism and sexism that I had experienced was something that I felt I had to work towards. Prior to that, I was already advocating for midwifery being funded in Alberta. But at that time it wasn't. And thanks to the work of Manmeet Bhullar, who has passed, he was working behind the scenes with the health minister to get midwifery funded in Alberta. And that is something that I will hold very, there's been so many babies now born in Alberta that had coverage for midwifery. And that is a win for me every time I hear a baby was born under the care of a midwife. So that's what prompted me to get involved politically. And unfortunately, you know, when you start walking the red road and start unpacking what racism actually is in our country, it's everywhere, it's insidious. So that work is what's really prompted me to be the advocate I am today. And yeah, thank you for asking.
Thanks, Michelle. Thanks for sharing that. Nashwan, what about you?
Well, hi, everyone. I just want to say thanks again for the land acknowledgement, Karen. I also have the privilege to live on Treaty 7. Yeah, I mean, I would say, I don't think there's a single moment. I think it's like few things you build on top of each other. Your personal background shapes how you think and feel about certain issues. I was born and raised in Yemen, and while I grew up in a privileged setting for sure, I still grew up in what's often labeled as the poorest country in the Arab world. So you witness injustice and you witness government corruption, and in a way you develop this innate understanding of equity and justice, and your values start leading your work. So I would say my personal simply shows up in my professional, and my personal has shown up in my corporate experience as well, because believe it or not, you can advocate within these circumstances as well in your capacity in a corporation or a business, or even as a funder, and even within government. I would also add that the general landscape you operate in is also evolving, and it influences how you think about advocacy. And you almost start seeing it in a multi-dimensional way. So yes, you have a specific issue and you have a specific public policy ask, but our society is passing through this social reckoning. And so we need to pay attention to this. And I often ask in my policy advocacy, who's missing at the decision table? Who does this benefit? And who does it leave out? We have to consider accessibility and social justice issues in our advocacy and even in programming. So I see it as, in this day and age, advocating cannot be disconnected from the reality we live in. Otherwise, it comes across tone deaf. So look, I think you advocate all the time. You do not stop advocating because you know success is when you make a change with decision makers and stakeholders, even if it was this tiny bit.
Thanks, Najwan. And what an important point about connecting advocacy work to the reality around us. That's, I think, really great insight. Danielle Jocelyn, let's go with you next.
So how I got into advocacy work. So about 3 years ago, I've been with Advocacy Is Not for about 3 years. And prior to that, I was in the private sector. I have a strong background in communications and in marketing, and I was head of strategy at a marketing agency. And, until I had what I called a quarter life crisis, and I realized that, I'm really good at what I do. And I say this without pretension. And I felt like if I wanted to grow as an individual, it was important for me to apply my skills and my network and my resources in ways that would have impact. And so I left the private sector and I did 360 in the community sector. And the first kind of glaring difference that I observed was this gap in communications and marketing strategy that the community sector and the advocacy world lacks. I've met great people who do great things, but, have this kind of, because we do God's work, it doesn't need to be packaged well. And that just doesn't work with youth today. It doesn't work with unengaged youth today. And it certainly doesn't work with, BIPOC youth who are disengaged from the system. And so our work at Advocacy Is Not really is to provide accessible information in ways that are compelling to youth, in ways that speak to youth, and particularly to youth who are faced with all of the isms, and have them re-engage with, just the democracy sector and reclaim that space that they deserve to be in.
Thanks so much. Chris, let's go to you next.
Sure. I don't have a lot to add to what my co-panelists have said, as they've said very really compelling things and have made me think. The reason I'm that I work in the advocacy field to whatever extent I work in it is, I've not faced an overwhelming number of barriers in my life. I think that's a bit of probably a bit of an understatement, but my parents, particularly my father, always impressed upon me that that as somebody who doesn't face a lot of barriers, you need to find a way to divert the extra energy that you get to help other people. And so they wanted me to do volunteering from a very early age. And as I put that energy towards whatever the volunteer opportunities I could find, or organizations I could help, and it was all very low level stuff because I was a kid. But as I kind of went into high school and university, I found that kind of thing really took my energy, really attracted my energy. So I would find any opportunity I could find to support and help any organization with extra time, or if an organization had a gap to fill, I would try and do whatever I could do to fill it. And it's just, and then I became the advocacy director at the University of Alberta Students Union, and then from there I went into private practice where I help a lot of nonprofits prepare to advocate for themselves to government or to stakeholders or whatever it is. I don't advocate on their behalf, but I do sort of coach them into doing it. And but it all comes from that reminder from my parents that, you know, you're lucky to be who you are, and you need to make sure that a fundamental part of your life is making sure that you're using the extra energy that you get from not having to struggle in one form or another to help others. So and I've kind of turned it into a profession or a career.
That's awesome, Chris. Thank you. And lovely to hear about your parents pushing you, because I had a similar experience. So we'll go with the next question. And this time we'll start with you, Najwan. Advocacy can be an extremely dynamic space. So how do you build a strategy for advocacy that is responsive and adaptive so that you can ensure success?
Yeah. So I think for me to be responsive and adaptive is around three things. First, you have to be super clear and well-versed in your policy ask. Someone asked me once, if you have 10 or 5 minutes with a policy or a decision maker, what would you tell them? So you have to be ready. So it takes a lot of practice to simplify a big ask into something that is crisp clear to a senior official, but you need to know enough details in order to give it to the policy researcher. So it's that adaptation to doing or giving your ask in different situations. So I encourage you to get training, just do some training, sign up for the Maxwell Foundation public policy training, for example. Second thing I would say, you have to be clear about the value you present to stakeholders and to the government. So what is your value proposition? Mary, can you please just share the slide? I only have one slide, I promise. It's just hard to explain this visual. So this is what I'm going to share is the Popper's diamond. And what I like about it, it shows the different sources of knowledge that government needs to create evidence-based policy. And government really needs that expertise, and I can't see it now anymore, expertise and are you able to see it? It's so small. And knowledge, that's the multi-criteria panel. This is the research. This is the analytical research that is required for that solid evidence for policy. And we absolutely need that. I encourage you to learn if your organization plays on the other side, which is that creativity and interaction. This is an area where you do the scenario making, the workshopping, the polling, the voting. This is where you bring lived experiences to policy. And the most recent initiative I'm involved in touches on that area, the Next 30. This is where we engaged with 2,500 members of the public here in Alberta to gather new ideas and bold ways of moving forward as a province. So the framing has been, we are facing some existential questions here in Alberta, and we cannot approach the next 30 years in this either or type of mindset. So questions we asked, how can Alberta turn the global energy transition from a risk into an opportunity? How can we create a more predictable and sustainable fiscal framework that maintains competitive tax rates and also effective public services? How can we build meaningful partnerships with the Indigenous peoples in Canada, and so on? So moving away from that black and white approach. So know your value proposition. You have to be able to speak to that in different scenarios as the landscape changes and as your stakeholder management evolves as well. The third thing quickly, I would say advocacy is not about a single win or this one single big thing. Yes, it would be lovely if we get everything we want, but think of breaking down your goals and achieving them in short-term steps. So for example, I would love it if we can implement a provincial emissions target launched from the Premier's office, but maybe this will not work right now. So maybe I'll try to advance or advocate for a technology roadmap within the Energy Ministry to reduce emissions from the oil and gas sector. So consider the smaller wins. You have to adapt to the context and the type of government you're dealing with. So advocacy, I would just say, is a way of being. You have to be comfortable with working in uncertainty and in that lack of clarity. Is this advocacy perfect? No. Are we making change? Yes. Is the change at scale? Not always. So are we adapting and adjusting? Absolutely. So the keywords for me are reevaluation, adaptation, and adjustment, and knowing really what value you bring to the conversation.
Thanks, Najwan. That was a really great comprehensive answer. Danielle Jocelyn, we'll go with you next.
Yeah, I think that one thing that has allowed Apathy Is Boring to prosper over the last 20 years, or one of the oldest kind of youth-led organizations in the country, is that we've learned to value data over assumption. We've invested way too much, according, if you ask my director, into research, into really fundamentally understanding youth culture and youth values. We are adamant about youth not being perceived as a monolith. And so we invest twice as more into BIPOC specific research and really understanding what Black and Indigenous youth experiences are versus white youth are, what Black and Indigenous values are versus, white youth values are. And that allows us to really get a 360 vision of youth culture in Canada today and how they engage with the system. And then it allows us to speak from a position of authority. And it allows us to create programs more adequately and more responsively. And overall, just have the youth who work with us, for us, to feel like they relate to our culture and the experiences that we put out there. And then the second point, I would say in terms of engagement would be to, specifically when it comes to youth, we speak to youth like we are youth. We leave the jargon at the door. We really oversimplify sometimes some of the information that we give them in ways that they feel like they can relate and connect to, because they are disconnected from the system. And therefore asking them to vote doesn't work because they weren't voting before. And so learning how to speak to them, to listen to them, to make them feel heard, and kind of work our way up and pull them further along the ladder of engagement has worked for us in wonderful ways.
That's such an important reminder to kind of not speak at people, but speak as though you are one. Chris, what about you?
Yeah, I a lot of what Najwan said really resonated with me, so I'm not going to repeat any of what she said. But one thing I might add to that is, Najwan made a point about like little victories, and I think it is important to. I think breakthroughs in advocacy are very rare, and I think like large scale, like we got it all done in one go, are really rare. What I think matters the most in advocacy is consistency, and consistency is, I think, really important because for one, it's cheaper than gunning for a breakthrough, because you can even if you don't get exactly what you want, you can build capacity within your organization as you go along. But most advocacy is built on like Najwan said, it's a small, like little victories that occur sort of every day or on regular intervals, and then all of a sudden the thing that you're, the accumulation of those little victories turns into, maybe turns into a major policy change. There's so much work that goes into advocating for a clause or a full bill that gets put forward, and but what comes with that consistency is a need to make sure that you don't get discouraged when you're not seeing large results at regular intervals. You kind of have to develop your strategy, and you have to sit with that strategy, and you have to have faith that the strategy is well prepared, well executed, and that it will pay off, and finding little ways to measure those smaller victories as you go. But I think I remember when I was at the U of A Students Union, I thought, well, we're just going to make it. We're going to go in, we're going to talk to the minister, we're going to make the best case he's ever heard, and then done, no problem. And I got disavowed of that notion pretty quickly. And since then, we've, I learned. Sorry, I learned in that instance, which everybody followed me to yes, yes, Chris is gonna. It was so compelling the way he said it. And then the minister can't say no. And then after that, we kind of came back and said, okay, let's break this down into very, very, very small pieces and accomplish one of them every single day. And we got more success than we, I think, had hoped after we initially thought we would just solve it in a 25-minute meeting.
It's a great story. Thanks for sharing that. Michelle?
So I'm just kind of rereading the question of advocacy can be a dynamic space. How do you build a strategy for advocacy that is responsive and adaptive to ensure success? As an Indigenous person in Canada, a lot of our advocacy is responsive, actually. I'm listening to everybody's plans about strategy, and I know that this is a colonial framework that has never worked for Indigenous, has never intended to work for Indigenous. So that's part of the reason why we just have to continue going. And I think our advocacy has been intergenerational. I'm just the next generation in comparison to my mother's generation and my grandmother's generation that has done this advocacy work all through the decades. And we've had many of our reports, our inquiries, just collect dust on a shelf and not move forward because Canada talks about being equitable, but it isn't, and it most definitely isn't for Indigenous people, and most likely at the expense of Indigenous people. So I'm living a genocide, and I know that's an uncomfortable truth for a lot of folks that are listening with us today, but that is the truth that Indigenous people are faced with, and it's not just us. There are many BIMPOC that are if you look into our jails right now, the numbers of over incarceration for representation for people who look like me, or people who look like other people that are of color, we are talking about multi-generations of institutionalized racism. So these colonial frameworks actually don't work for Indigenous people. So for us, we come from more of a sharing circle mentality, where we have a circle and we just allow everybody an opportunity to speak, and we collaborate in that way, and we try to bring the bulk of that information to government. But I mean, since the beginning of treaty, we have seen the government disregard that information, our data, our truth telling, and have just disregarded it. So we talk about just rereading the question about strategy for advocacy. I mean, we've never been picking up arms against the government in order to try to get that work going. And honestly, the next generation, I'm very concerned, are going to be more violent than these other generations, because of these colonial frameworks of that are imposed and not accessible. There's so many barriers to be a part of these discussions and circles. And from my point of view too, we have so many different ways of advocacy in our world. So for example, I'll think of somebody like Russ Dybel, who does this policy work at a national level. And I think of Manuel, sorry, who's at Wet'suwet'en right now, under attack from the oil companies and the RCMP. And the advocacy she's doing at the grassroots level is as needed as my work at the Indigenous Peoples Commission at the federal level, talking about these problems, just as it is for me to run municipally and provincially to talk about these issues. And then, of course, having folks that are just in nonprofit, advocating in the nonprofit circles, and then having our protests on the ground to showcase to Canada that, whatever our topic of the day is, most recently, I want to honor the missing children and unmarked graves of our residential prisons that we were imposed to go into. These are our issues of the day that we're constantly talking about, but the media is ignoring us, as well as a lot of these institutions that claim that they're for equity. So I think our strategy from an Indigenous point of view is that it's multi-layered, multifaceted, well, it's national, but it's there's grassroots, there's municipal, there's nonprofit, then there's provincial and federal, and we have to tackle every level of government, every type of business, nonprofit, club, association, to try to bring our issues to the forefront. So I don't know how effective it is, but we adapt, and we have adapted, and that's why we're still here advocating. So I hope that kind of gives an overall idea about my approach to it.
Yeah, that was really valuable, Michelle. Thank you for sharing that extremely important perspective.
Can I build off of that? That
Of
was
course.
so lovely, Michelle. Thank you so much for naming that.
Danielle Jocelyn.
I think, when we speak of advocacy, sometimes it kind of stays up here in terms of policymakers. But in an ideal world, and if we are to rethink what advocacy really looks like, it's the people who are closest to the problem are also part of coming up with the solutions. And I think, at Apathy Is Boring, we have a shakers, makers, uptakers model where in an ideal world, the grassroots folks who are the shakers and who flag the problem work with, organizations who are nonprofit organizations and groups and clubs who are the makers, who then work with policy and decision makers who are uptakers, and you kind of move the issue up to the top. And have the folks at the top work their way down, and you work in that kind of collaborative way. And to Michelle's point, I think the ways in which right now we speak of or we see advocacy very much kind of remains here, and distances themselves are the issue that is very much here. And so how do we bridge that gap and allow the folks, oftentimes BIPOC folks who are experiencing the most trauma and the most issues, to be at these tables?
Can I add just one last thing?
Yeah.
I love this discussion. Thank you, Michelle, for highlighting all that. I think one of the challenges is that the policy making space is a very old and traditional system. So we talked about bridging, as Danielle Jocelyn mentioned. I would love if the policy making process itself includes true representation. Like the actual people working on the policies need to be from these groups that are impacted by the policy. But what we're seeing is that this is not necessarily happening. Like you could have the evidence, you can have the research, but if you're not having the people there in the room at that decision table, that evidence might not make it in the way it should be. So just a little addition there.
These, I think, discussions are extremely important. And I'm actually, because of the kind of thing that Michelle raised, I'm going to actually bring up an audience question right now, because it is related. And Michelle, I'd love to hear from you first, and then everybody else kind of feel free to weigh in. I'll let this one be a little bit more of a natural discussion. So the question is, there seems to be a lot of interest emerging in the nonprofit sector to work toward reconciliation and racial justice. I'm not sure the sector is aware of the advocacy efforts that have always existed from edgewalkers, changemakers, like those advocates in the community and on this panel. At what point does it become less of an option and more of a responsibility for organizations? And are we there already?
Oh, I wish we were. And when I see the word edgewalker, I think immediately of the Calgary Foundation and the great work that Tim Fox has been doing, how hard it is to try to advocate in such a good way. And he does such a brilliant way of doing that. So shout out to the Calgary Foundation for trying to do this work. And I bring up them not just for the term edge walking, but they are actually working really hard right now at something called an audit. So a lot of nonprofits are unaware that, first of all, there are resources available. And I've been putting together some resources that I want to share. And one of them is from the Community Wise here in Calgary, and they have something called AROC, which is anti-racism organizational change. literally tools that are available for organizations to do some anti-racism work and some Indigenous education. And then it's one thing to have a policy, much like an anti-bullying policy or an equity policy, but it's another to implement it. And I've always challenged companies on, what does an anti-bullying policy look like in real time for you? Show me some examples. Never getting an answer. Never get an answer about what is equity and how does that relate to your company, and show me ways that you've done that work. And actually you don't get that answer. But Calgary Foundation, community-wise, a rock branch are working together at something called auditing. So, you do an assessment of your organization and how equitable it actually is, but then you do an audit about improvements that you can do. And so this advocacy has been happening at so many different levels. And there has been purposeful barriers put in place. And most people don't want to deal with racism. They don't want to deal with like anti-Indigenous bias or sexism, whichever it is that their company is facing, which is usually all of them. That oppression dynamics is a real issue that needs audit. And there are policies in place to start working on that. And I just bring up them because they've been doing this work since 2016. But there's actually a graph that goes around, and it's from this group that has done equity work at the Center for Communication or Community Organizations. And they have a graphic about the problem of women of color in the workplace. And they actually have a video that goes along with it. So I bring that up because I would love to have, Call to Action 92 is business and reconciliation. And we are not seeing that conversation happening. And then at the government levels, Truth and Reconciliation Commission Call to Action 57 is anti-racism training as well as Indigenous education. And we're not seeing that implemented. And I'll give a personal example. I put my daughter in a City of Calgary Indigenous youth program, and the facilitator called me, who was non-Indigenous, and I mentioned TRC, and they asked me, what is TRC? And I said, well, you just showed me how good the City of Calgary is doing on that TRC work. If I say that word, you don't even know what it is, let alone all of the equity that should be going into the policy that creates that. So this is where we're at as a society. So there is a huge gap between Indigenous community and business and sports and nonprofit government at so many levels when it comes to this. And then the other problem that we're facing right now, it seems, as the Indigenous community is this umbrella of BIPOC. We're different than a settler who's a person of color. We are the original people with the inherent rights, language, culture that should be a part of the fabric of Canada that isn't. That's been purposely, we've been, I don't like to use the term assimilated because we're not. We still carry our culture, our language, and our practices, but they're just not making the way into the British imposed systems through nonprofits and through business and through language, all of these things. So I hope that helps answers that question to whoever asked it. And I thank you for asking that question.
Does anybody else want to add on to that answer?
Yeah, I want to add that I've been involved in different organizations that have all the good intentions in doing this. However, booking a one-day anti-racism training is not enough. Mixing EDI with anti-racism is not, they're two different things. Everyone is in a journey for truth and reconciliation. And I find that many of us have the really good intentions to learn, and we have to sit in that discomfort of learning the historical violence that happened, and we continue to discover the extent of all that violence. So we need to sit with that truth. But sitting with the truth doesn't mean we cannot be actively doing work towards reconciliation. So I find that many places we're learning, we're trying to learn, it's just a continuous process, but then we fail to actually make this operational. Like, how do you change that inside your processes, your recruitment, the way people show up? many organizations just hire that one person and just lean heavily on them, and it's just they do all that labor for the organization. It's jarring. Don't do that. It's bringing that one person in the room. Like, it's horrible. I'm just not going to sugarcoat this. So there is a gap, absolutely. It's a long process. I want to acknowledge this is hard work, and we have to put the time for it. It has to be on your agenda. It has to be on your weekly meeting agenda. Otherwise, it's not going to be done. Find a way to evaluate it. This is a systems problem. This is not just one tick done. So there's a gap. That's my conclusion. Absolutely.
Absolutely.
I'll just maybe add that, one thing about working in the youth sector is, I have to say, I think youth-led organizations are doing much better than non-youth-led organizations at that. I'm going to give my generation and the generation after me kudos for kind of leading the way in these changes and these conversations. And I'm in a senior leadership position, and we are one of the most diverse staff I've ever been in my life. And the amount of accountability that the youth in our team hold us to, it'd be hard for us to even consider doing otherwise. There's still tremendous work to be done, obviously. But I will give kudos to Gen Z, to Michelle's point, because I don't think people, oftentimes institutions understand what's coming. They're not prepared for this generation because they are ruthless. They're ruthless for me, and I'm 5 years older than them. You know what I mean? So they are ruthless, and they will absolutely tear down anything that doesn't feel in line with the direction that this world should be going into.
Thanks, Danielle Jocelyn. That's kind of a hopeful way to pivot to our next question. So, I mean, I think we all kind of heard the news today that it's highly likely that a federal election is going to be called on Sunday. We are in the midst of a municipal election. So what types of things should nonprofits consider as part of advocating during an election cycle? And Chris, let's start with you.
Thank you. Well, a really important thing was to be advocating as parties were building their platforms that they're going to be putting into this election. A lot of the advocacy during an election, I find, is kind of difficult because it often enough requires people to step back from a policy announcement that they've already made. But my main advice here to a lot of my clients and a lot of the organizations that I work with actually touches on a point that that Danielle Jocelyn made earlier about transmitting information through the people that are closest to the issue. I think repetition from many sources, media, volunteers, to media, from your volunteers to candidates to their staff, just repeating a short set of very disciplined messages over and over and over during an election, I think can pay real dividends for you after the election, and can help start a conversation around policy initiatives maybe you think are counter to your to your mission. So that's my main advice. A lot of my professional advice is repetition generally, but repetition on a few 2 to 3 specific key messages coming from as many sources as you can to as many sources as possible that have an effect on those decisions.
Thank you so much. Danielle Jocelyn, do you want to add to that as well?
I mean, I think that one thing that we're being faced with as an organization today, and for this round of elections, that we didn't necessarily consider in the 2019 election or the countless of provincial and municipal elections that we've run. Just for context, folks, we work with Elections Canada and other provincial and municipal election agencies to get out the youth vote. And, I think as part of our own decolonization journey as an organization, we are faced with this reckoning and just realization that democracy in and of itself is a colonial system. And so when we're asking Indigenous youth to go out and vote, and Black and youth of color to get out to vote, we're mindful of how we do so. We're very intentional about the ways in which our get out the vote messages are different, and working with different community leaders and members to get that information out, because youth need to hear these messages differently. And so for me, I think if you are an organization working with a variety of youth, maybe working directly with community leaders and community organizations who are serving that youth population, to get your messages out in a way that speaks directly to them and has their concerns answered. Because kind of general, again, just staple get out the vote message doesn't work for everybody.
Absolutely. Najwan, let's hear from you.
I'll be quick. I'm realizing the time. I mean, the classic advice is to try to get your issue into the election platform. This is the absolute lovely ideal scenario. The thing is, this is really hard without the relationship, the continuous relationship. But if you have connections, give them a call, see their advice. It might be hard for a next week election, but there's always a next election, and there's always, you can just have the chat. For this municipal election, something we've done with Ask Her YYC is that we wanted to get our issue or cause to the candidates, and we wanted to see where they stand on it. So we created what we call the Ask Her 2021 Municipal Election Candidate Survey. So we asked questions like, what does a feminist city mean to you? What is the most important policy in your platform that addresses systemic barriers? And then we publish quotes from their responses on our social media and highlight what the candidate had told us. So you start making your issue top of mind for candidates, and you socialize your issue for voters, for the government, and you're also building that relationship and opening that line of communications with maybe future policymakers. So it is a good tactic. I've seen it recently as well with Disability Action Hall. Something else, it is a high risk, high reward type of situation. I haven't done it myself, but can your issue become an election issue? Again, this is high risk, a high reward situation. So it depends on your strategy, the organization's culture, and the risk tolerance. But let's say there's an election and you have a health focused issue here. And we know health is top of mind right now. Can you inform your advocates, and can you inform opposition to ask these questions at the legislature? There's a conversation, a heated conversation, media picks it up, and voila, your issue starts getting some traction, and thus the government's attention as well. Again, you have to tread this with so much mindfulness. It depends on your strategy, the way you advocate, and your risk tolerance. So some thoughts.
Do you find that these tactics work for folks on the margins?
It depends.
Genuine question. I'm just wondering, is this?
Again, it depends on the type of advocacy I would say you lead. Are you like doing inside type of strategy, one-on-ones with the senior leaders and senior officials, or your advocacy style is always on the outside? So I think of Alberta Parks, for example. This is absolutely an outside type of strategy where you have the petitions, the lawn signs, it's different. But if your advocacy is very on the cautious side, I'm not too sure. So it's the style of advocacy rather than the type, I would say.
I think
Chris, you might have some thoughts there.
I think the external issues definitely have, for folks on the margins, I think every issue has a lot of issues can have a moment, right? In elections, the the best advice I've ever heard in elections is about elections is elections matter. Nothing is decided from the beginning, not the winner, not the issues. It just takes something to open up, and then a group on the margins might be able to get in there and not just make people see the light, but also make them feel the heat. And so I think but you have to have a relatively sophisticated operation to recognize it, for one, and then to activate and take advantage of it. So I think I think my answer to your question, Danielle Jocelyn, excuse me.
You're good.
Even though it wasn't directed to me, is that I think so, but some of it's luck, and then the rest of it after that is skill.
Okay, just for the sake of time, I'm going to move on to the next question and start with you, Michelle. So this is another audience question, and it is that due to limited resources and experts in the nonprofit sector, what are some recommendations for organizations to overcome funding limitations that may impact the level and type of advocacy and change they can accomplish?
That's the whole point of the colonial structure, so that you can't do this. I'm really sad to tell you this. So, I think too, like, nonprofits specifically are very much tied to colonial politics, because if they do it wrong, they lose their funding. It's really that simple. So that's why, as an Indigenous organization, a lot of us will not register with the government of Canada, with the government of Alberta, because as soon as you do, then you're tied to the colonial structures and laws that they, imposed. And of course, that defeats the purpose of the Indigenous advocacy that we do, because it, puts us into these colonial boundaries. So what was the question? Sorry, I kind of lost myself already.
Yeah, no worries. So I'll just say it one more time. Due to limited resources and experts in the nonprofit sector, what are some recommendations for organizations to overcome funding limitations that may impact the level and type of advocacy and change that they can accomplish?
Yeah, I just, it's a barrier in itself. The question is its own barrier. And, I know we're in interest of time trying to kind of skip number 3, but I didn't get a chance to answer it. The reason why I ran municipally and provincially is to actually give a platform, because unfortunately for nonprofits, like, even the nonprofit sector can't even endorse a candidate, because if they do, then that hurts their funding in the future. And so that's really problematic. And that's why I ran, was because we are not being given the platforms that we need. And I don't know if nonprofit can be it, because it's so already in bed with the governments that need the changes that are being done. And I have to tell people, you can still push. One of the non-registered works that we do is, it was called Langevin Name Change, but now we have it, the Reconciliation Action Group. And like this, we're just going to build a spreadsheet and ask certain questions and put it out there for people. And, you can just ask your entire team to be a part of that in the best way that they can. But that is the best thing that I think people could do. But again, it's a really risky strategy because if you are asking the wrong questions and the wrong government is so for example, if I asked Jason Kenney his opinion on Indigenous issues, and I put it very clearly, this was his, opinion, and it's very clearly detrimental, I'm not going to get my funding. Right? It's really that simple. So I don't know if they're, like, we have to just be honest. The colonial system is structured in a way so that you're not meant to get your funding if you have the audacity to step out of line. And I say that as an Albertan who's been here my entire life and has watched organizations fail because of the change in government and the advocacy that they do.
Thanks, Michelle. Danielle Jocelyn, I'm going to ask you the same question, and I might just say it again in case you want me to repeat it. Yeah, let me do that. So the question is, due to limited resources and experts in the nonprofit sector, what are some recommendations for organizations to overcome funding limitations that may impact the level and type of advocacy and change they can accomplish?
I have so much to say on this that I'm going to try to condense it very shortly. So we are a nonpartisan organization. It is very difficult for us to walk that line, especially today, especially over the last year and a half. However, since I've joined the organization in the last 4 years, we went from, $250,000 funding to $4 million funding just by diversifying our funding strategy and our funders. And that's always been kind of top of mind in terms of our development strategy and our innovation strategy. We rely heavily on the government, but we also do not. We have corporate partners, we have individual sponsors, and then we have high net worth individuals. I think oftentimes the nonprofit, to my earlier point in regards to strategy that the private sector holds, the nonprofit isn't equipped with these tools and this knowledge to know how to diversify their funding and where they can get funding from. And therefore we kind of stay trapped in this lack mentality that tells us that we can only get funding from the government. That's not true. It's not true. It's the biggest lie. There are so many other avenues, especially today with social media. We invest tremendously in our communications because we have direct access to youth, tens of thousands of youth across the country who can become donors. We have an alumni system that become donors, and we engage with these folks very intentionally so throughout the year. And we have a strategy in terms of how we engage with who, because some folks can become donors by monthly donors. Some folks can buy a sweater on our eShop. Some folks can choose to donate one large amount. And all of this is part of our strategy. And I think for me, part of innovation in general, and when you speak of social innovation, it's like, how do we reimagine the ways in which nonprofits can make money? We have a consulting arm that makes money for us. And we don't shy away from cross-sectoral partnerships. A lot of people kind of spit on corporate partnerships and corporate money because they're like, well, no, the corporations, we don't, obviously to a certain extent, and we kind of do our due diligence. But if RBC is tricky, but I'm like, but we do have a great partnership with RBC, and corporate social responsibility is so huge right now, and organizations, the private sector is dying to find ways to divest their funds in ways that impact their communities. And there's so much. I can talk forever, but that's.
Thank you. Yeah, well, we appreciate that that quick answer, and I know we're almost at the end of time, so I'm just going to invite Karen Ball back to give us some closing remarks. Thanks, Karen. And thanks to our panelists who are amazing.
Thank you, Esmahan, and thank you to all the panelists. And I hate to step in on this conversation because I was wrapped. I could listen for another hour. I got a lot out of it. I'm taking away the feeling that advocacy is personal, sometimes multi-generational, but definitely personal. And it helps me in thinking that I'm not alone in the fight that we fight every day, and that we're fighting alongside such great voices across the province and the country. So thank you all for being part of that. Before we end this session today, I did want to invite people here today to join us for 2 upcoming events where we will continue this conversation for nonprofit advocacy. The first is at our AGM. So members will be able to join us, as well as others, for the next nonprofit at 2, which will also have a small bit of AGM business. And very, very happy to be able to be unveiling a unified voice for Alberta's nonprofit sector called the Nonprofit Vote at that time. So looking forward to sharing more information about shared nonprofit advocacy in Alberta and where we're heading with it on September 23rd. And please save the date for our 9th annual Connections Conference, taking place virtually and in location in Calgary and Edmonton, November 8th, with a keynote address from Senator Ahmedvar, and then 2 half-day conference that happens virtually on the 9th and 10th, and finishing with a keynote on November 10th from Vule from Nonprofit AF. So we hope you'll be able to join us then in November at our Connections Conference. Thank you again to our presenting sponsor today, ATB Financial, and to our core and media sponsors and partners. Thank you to everyone that attended today, especially to our moderator and panelists. And thank you for all that you do every day. Keep raising your voice. Please take a moment to complete our short survey that you'll see pop up afterwards to help us improve nonprofits at 2 and respond to the things that are of most interest to you as we go forward. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon, and I hope you can join us again soon. And I'll do the obligatory Zoom wave.
High five to Esmahan.
So much.
Thank